The gods of ancient Egypt were not what we were told. What if everything you have been told about the gods of ancient Egypt is wrong? Not slightly wrong, not missing a few details, completely wrong. For generations, we have been taught to see Egyptian gods as mythological characters. A falcon-headed god, a jackal-headed god. Strange figures painted on temple walls and buried inside forgotten tombs. We place them in the same category as legends, symbols, and stories invented to explain a mysterious world. But what if the Egyptians themselves never saw them that way? Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile more than 4,000 years ago. The sun rises through a veil of mist. Farmers stop their work to whisper prayers. Priests prepare rituals before dawn. Messengers carry orders sealed with sacred symbols. Across the kingdom, every decision, from the movement of armies to the construction of monuments, unfolds under the watchful presence of powers believed to be absolutely real. This was not a civilization that merely worshipped gods. It was a civilization built around them. The gods were woven into every law, every harvest, every royal decree, every judgment, every victory, and every fear. They were not distant beings living only in stories. They shaped reality itself. At least, that is how the Egyptians understood the world. Yet a strange question emerges when we look deeper into the evidence they left behind. If these gods were simply symbols, why did entire generations devote unimaginable resources to serving them? Why did kings spend fortunes building temples for beings they could never see? Why did priests guard sacred knowledge with such intensity? Why were certain names erased from history while others were elevated to eternal status? The deeper archaeologists dig beneath the sands of Egypt, the more complicated the picture becomes. Behind the famous pyramids lies a forgotten world of rival cults, hidden ceremonies, political struggles, and beliefs far older than the civilization itself. Long before the great temples dominated the landscape, before the names of Ra, Osiris, and Amun became known throughout the kingdom, Egypt was a patchwork of communities with their own sacred traditions and local powers. The gods we recognize today did not appear fully formed. They evolved, they changed, they competed, and in some cases, they were transformed by the ambitions of human beings. That raises an even more disturbing possibility. What if the story of Egypt's gods is not simply the story of religion? What if it is also the story of power, survival, identity, and the creation of one of the most successful civilizations in human history? Tonight, we are not exploring myths. We are entering the world that created them. A world where the line between politics and divinity barely existed. A world where unseen forces governed daily life. A world where entire populations believed that chaos itself waited just beyond the borders of order. And before we can understand how Egypt's gods came to dominate an empire, we must travel back to a time when those gods did not yet rule, a time almost forgotten, a time before the pantheon, a time before Egypt became Egypt, before the gods ruled Egypt, thousands of years before the Great Pyramids pierced the horizon, before colossal temples dominated the Nile Valley, and before powerful priests spoke in the names of gods known across an empire. Egypt was not a unified civilization. It was a mosaic of isolated communities scattered along the river's fertile banks. Each village lived according to its own traditions, fears, and beliefs. There was no grand pantheon, no central authority defining the divine, and no single story explaining humanity's place in the universe. The Egypt we recognize today did not yet exist, neither did the gods who would one day rule it. To understand what came later, we must step into a much older world, a world where survival depended on forces that seemed impossible to control. Every year, the Nile flooded without warning. Sometimes it brought abundance and prosperity. Other times, it brought destruction and uncertainty. The desert loomed beyond the green riverbanks, like an endless sea of death. Dangerous animals moved through the wilderness. Disease appeared without explanation. For these early communities, the world was not governed by natural laws. It was governed by living powers that revealed themselves through every blessing and every catastrophe. As a result, sacred beliefs emerged differently from one region to another. In one settlement, a powerful bird soaring above the river might become a symbol of protection. In another, a fierce predator could represent strength and authority. Certain communities believed specific hills, caves, trees, or stretches of water possessed unique spiritual significance. These were not yet gods in the form later generations would recognize. They were local powers tied directly to the landscape itself. Their influence rarely extended beyond the communities that honored them. As centuries passed, villages grew into towns, and towns became centers of trade. Merchants traveled farther. Leaders expanded their influence. Different populations encountered one another more frequently than ever before. With these encounters came something unexpected. Beliefs began to travel alongside goods, ideas, and people. Sacred traditions that had once remained isolated started interacting. Local powers met rival powers. Stories merged. Symbols evolved. Slowly, a vast spiritual network began forming across the Nile Valley. This transformation was not peaceful or orderly. Just as rulers competed for territory, sacred traditions competed for influence. When one region became more powerful, its spiritual beliefs often spread with it. Some local deities absorbed the characteristics of others. Certain sacred animals gained wider recognition. Ancient stories were rewritten to fit changing political realities. Over generations, the spiritual map of Egypt became increasingly interconnected. The gods were not simply being worshipped, they were evolving alongside the civilization itself. The most remarkable part of this process is that nobody planned it. There was no master architect designing a religious system for the future. Instead, countless generations contributed small pieces to a much larger transformation. Each alliance, each conflict, each migration, and each political change altered the sacred landscape. What began as scattered local traditions slowly developed into something far more powerful, a shared spiritual framework capable of uniting millions of people under a common vision of reality. Yet one enormous challenge remained. If Egypt was ever going to become a single kingdom, it would need more than armies, trade routes, and ambitious rulers. It would need a belief system powerful enough to connect distant regions, competing populations, and different traditions. The future pharaohs understood that controlling land was one thing. Controlling how people understood the world was something else entirely. And that realization would give birth to one of the most extraordinary systems of belief ever created. The gods that would eventually dominate Egypt were not waiting at the beginning of the story. They were the result of centuries of change, adaptation, and human imagination. But once they emerged, they would become far more than objects of worship. They would shape politics, define truth, justify power, and influence every aspect of daily life. The question is not how people came to believe in the gods. The real question is how Egypt managed to make those gods feel undeniably real. The invention of divine reality. Imagine arriving in ancient Egypt as a traveler from a distant land. As your boat moves along the Nile, the first thing you notice is not the power of the pharaoh or the wealth of the cities. It is the overwhelming presence of the divine. Massive temples dominate the landscape. Towering columns rise toward the sky. Sacred banners move in the wind. Statues of gods stare across courtyards with expressions carved to inspire awe and obedience. Everywhere you look, the invisible has been given physical form. This was not an accident. One of the greatest achievements of Egyptian civilization was its ability to transform belief into something people could see, touch, hear, and experience. The gods were not confined to stories told around fires. They were built into the architecture itself. Every temple doorway, every ceremonial avenue, every sacred chamber was designed to communicate a simple message. The gods were real, present, and actively involved in the world. When ordinary people walked through these spaces, they were not merely observing religion. They were stepping into a carefully constructed reality. The power of this system extended far beyond stone and monuments. Rituals played an equally important role. Before sunrise, priests entered temple sanctuaries hidden from public view. They washed sacred statues, dressed them in fine garments, and presented offerings of food, incense, and precious goods. To modern eyes, these actions may seem symbolic. To the Egyptians, they were practical necessities. The gods were treated as living beings whose presence sustained the balance of the universe. Every ritual reinforced the belief that divine forces depended on constant interaction with humanity. Symbols carried this reality into everyday life. Farmers invoked sacred protection before planting crops. Soldiers marched beneath divine emblems into battle. Government officials sealed documents with imagery linked to cosmic authority. Even the movement of the sun across the sky was interpreted as evidence of divine activity. Religion was not a separate part of existence. It was woven into every decision, every occupation, and every expectation about how the world functioned. The gods became impossible to escape because they were embedded within the structure of daily life itself. What made this system so powerful was its consistency. A child growing up in Egypt would encounter the same sacred messages everywhere, in public ceremonies, in temple processions, in royal inscriptions, in stories passed from generation to generation. The entire civilization reinforced a shared understanding of reality. When millions of people experience the same symbols, rituals, and narratives throughout their lives, belief becomes more than faith. It becomes a framework through which the world is understood. Egypt mastered this process on a scale few civilizations have ever matched. Over time, the gods became more than protectors or creators. They became the foundation upon which authority rested. Pharaohs ruled because divine forces sanctioned their rule. Laws carried weight because they reflected sacred order. Victories in war were celebrated as proof of divine favor. Failures and disasters were interpreted through the same lens. The invisible was no longer separate from political power. It became one of its most important sources. To question the gods was increasingly to question the stability of society itself. Yet beneath this impressive system lay a fascinating contradiction. If the gods were truly all-powerful, why did they require endless ceremonies, offerings, and attention from human beings? Why did priests devote their entire lives to maintaining relationships between the divine and the mortal world? The answer reveals a belief far more unusual than most people realize. In ancient Egypt, dependence flowed in both directions. Humans needed the gods, but according to Egyptian thought, the gods also needed humans. And that idea would shape everything that followed. Why the gods needed human beings. Most religions teach a simple relationship. Humans need the gods. They pray for protection, guidance, prosperity, or salvation. The divine stands above humanity, complete and self-sufficient. Ancient Egypt, however, developed a far more complex vision of reality. According to many Egyptian beliefs, the survival of cosmic order depended not only on the gods, but also on the actions of human beings. The universe itself functioned as a partnership, and if one side failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. At the center of this worldview stood a concept known as Ma'at. More than justice, truth, or balance, Ma'at represented the fundamental order that kept existence from collapsing into chaos. The rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the changing seasons, political stability, and social harmony were all expressions of this sacred order. The gods protected it, but they could not do so alone. Humanity had a responsibility to help maintain it through rituals, offerings, obedience, and participation in the sacred rhythms of life. This belief transformed religious ceremonies into matters of cosmic importance. When priests entered temple sanctuaries each morning, they were not simply honoring divine beings. They believed they were actively sustaining the universe. Offerings placed before sacred statues were not symbolic gifts. They were essential acts that renewed the connection between the human world and the divine realm. Every prayer, every ritual, and every sacred procession reinforced the fragile balance holding reality together. If these practices ceased, disorder might begin to spread. The pharaoh occupied a unique position within this system. He was not merely a king chosen by the gods. He served as the crucial link between heaven and earth. His duty extended beyond governing people. He was responsible for preserving Ma'at itself. Through ceremonies, temple construction, military campaigns, and public acts of devotion, the ruler demonstrated that Egypt remained aligned with divine order. A successful reign proved that harmony still prevailed. Famine, rebellion, or foreign invasion could be interpreted as signs that the balance was weakening. This created an extraordinary sense of collective responsibility. Farmers cultivating fields, craftsmen building monuments, priests performing rituals, and rulers issuing decrees all participated in the same cosmic mission. Every person contributed, directly or indirectly, to maintaining the stability of the world. The gods were powerful, but their power flowed through a system that required human cooperation. Divine forces and mortal actions became inseparable parts of a single structure. One could not function properly without the other. Yet this relationship raised an uncomfortable question. If different gods helped preserve order, what happened when their interests collided? What happened when one deity became more important than another, when cities promoted rival divine patrons, or when ambitious rulers elevated certain gods above the rest? The answer reveals a side of Egyptian religion that is rarely discussed. Beneath the appearance of harmony, competition was constantly reshaping the divine world. The gods did not remain fixed in place. Like kings, dynasties, and empires, they rose, expanded their influence, absorbed rivals, and sometimes faded into obscurity. The pantheon that later generations inherited was not a peaceful family of eternal beings. It was the result of centuries of transformation, negotiation, and struggle. To understand the true nature of Egypt's gods, we must look beyond the temples and into the hidden battles that unfolded within the sacred world itself. Because even among the gods, power was never guaranteed. The hidden competition among the gods. When most people imagine the gods of ancient Egypt, they picture a stable pantheon that remained unchanged for thousands of years. Ra ruled the sun. Osiris ruled the dead. Horus protected kingship. Anubis guided souls. It appears orderly, timeless, and permanent. But the reality was far more dynamic. Behind the familiar images found in museums and textbooks was a constantly evolving spiritual landscape where divine power shifted from century to century, often reflecting the political struggles taking place in the human world. As cities grew in wealth and influence, the gods associated with those cities frequently grew alongside them. A deity worshipped by a small local population could suddenly gain prominence if its home region became politically important. What began as a local sacred figure might eventually be elevated to national significance. The rise of a god often mirrored the rise of the people who promoted that god. In many ways, the divine world became a reflection of Egypt's changing balance of power. One of the most fascinating examples can be seen in the growing influence of Amun. For generations, he was a relatively minor deity, known primarily within a limited region. But when Thebes emerged as a dominant political center, Amun's status transformed dramatically. Priests expanded his mythology, rulers associated themselves with his authority. New temples were constructed in his honor. Over time, Amun became one of the most powerful divine figures in Egypt. His rise was not simply a religious development. It was closely connected to the ambitions of a city and the rulers who governed it. This process did not always involve direct conflict. More often, Egyptian religion adapted through absorption and fusion. Rather than eliminating older deities, new traditions frequently incorporated them. Gods merged identities. Attributes overlapped. Sacred stories evolved. Ra became linked with Amun. Local traditions blended with national beliefs. The result was a religious system capable of expanding without completely abandoning its past. Yet beneath this flexibility lay an ongoing struggle for relevance and influence. Divine prominence had to be maintained, reinforced, and protected. The priesthoods understood this reality well. Powerful temples competed for resources, royal support, and public devotion. A successful cult attracted wealth, land, labor, and prestige. The more influential a god became, the stronger the institution supporting that god grew. In some periods, temple complexes accumulated enormous economic and political power. Their influence reached far beyond religious matters. They shaped policy, advised rulers, and controlled vast resources. Promoting a god could also mean strengthening a powerful human organization operating behind the scenes. Over centuries, this constant evolution transformed the Egyptian pantheon into a living system rather than a fixed collection of divine beings. Gods changed because society changed. New challenges demanded new interpretations. Political shifts created opportunities for some deities while diminishing others. What appears eternal when viewed from a distance was actually the product of continuous adaptation. Egypt's gods survived for millennia precisely because they evolved with the civilization that worshipped them. Yet there came a moment when adaptation was no longer enough. A ruler emerged who looked at the immense power accumulated by temples and priesthoods and decided that the entire system had become too powerful. What followed was one of the most shocking revolutions in ancient history. A single man attempted to overturn centuries of tradition, challenge the authority of the gods themselves, and redefine the relationship between humanity and the divine. His actions would shake Egypt to its core and leave scars that endured long after his death. The fear that lived beyond the temples. To understand why the gods held such extraordinary power over Egyptian society, we must look beyond the magnificent temples, the golden statues, and the grand ceremonies. We must step into the fears that haunted the minds of ordinary Egyptians. Because the true strength of the gods did not come only from what people hoped for. It came from what they desperately feared. Each evening, as the sun disappeared beneath the western horizon, a silent drama began in the Egyptian imagination. To modern observers, sunset marks the end of a day. To the Egyptians, it signaled the beginning of a dangerous journey. The sun god entered a hidden realm beneath the world, traveling through darkness where terrifying forces waited. Every night was a battle. Every dawn was a victory. The sunrise itself was proof that order had survived for another day. This belief reveals something fundamental about how Egyptians viewed existence. They did not see the universe as naturally stable. They believed chaos was always present, waiting for an opportunity to return. Beyond the cultivated fields of the Nile stretched the desert, a place associated not only with physical danger, but with disorder itself. The wilderness represented a realm beyond human control, where the protective structures of civilization ended and uncertainty began. At the center of these fears stood powerful forces that threatened the balance of creation. Among them was the great serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Unlike many other figures in Egyptian belief, Apophis could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or converted into an ally. He existed for one purpose alone: to destroy order and plunge the universe back into darkness. Priests performed rituals specifically designed to weaken him. Sacred texts described his defeat night after night. Yet he never disappeared. The threat remained eternal. These fears extended far beyond cosmic monsters. The world of the dead was filled with dangers of its own. A successful journey into the afterlife was never guaranteed. Souls faced obstacles, judgments, and hostile beings capable of preventing eternal existence. This is why tombs contained detailed instructions, protective spells, and sacred formulas. The Egyptians were preparing not for a peaceful rest, but for a dangerous passage through an unseen world filled with uncertainty. Death was not an ending. It was a test. Even daily life carried reminders of vulnerability. Failed harvests, disease outbreaks, political unrest, and foreign invasions could all be interpreted as signs that cosmic balance was weakening. The gods were not simply worshipped because they offered blessings. They were needed because they stood between humanity and forces that threatened to unravel reality itself. Their importance grew from the belief that without divine protection, civilization could collapse into chaos at any moment. This constant tension between order and disorder shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. It justified rituals, it strengthened priesthoods, it reinforced loyalty to sacred traditions. Most importantly, it convinced generations of people that maintaining the favor of the gods was not optional. It was necessary for survival. The gods were guardians standing at the edge of an abyss, holding back forces too dangerous to ignore. But what happens when people begin to question those guardians? What happens when economic hardship, social upheaval, or political instability causes ordinary men and women to doubt the very system that promised protection? For all the power of the temples and the authority of the priests, there came moments when common Egyptians began searching for answers elsewhere. And those moments would reveal cracks in a system that had appeared unshakable for centuries. When ordinary people challenged the divine system. History often tells the story of ancient Egypt through the eyes of pharaohs, generals, and high priests. Their monuments survived. Their names were carved into stone. Their achievements were recorded for future generations. But beyond the palace walls and temple complexes lived millions of ordinary Egyptians whose experiences rarely appear in grand historical narratives. Yet it was among these people that some of the most important changes in Egyptian belief quietly began. For centuries, the divine system appeared unbreakable. The gods governed the cosmos. The pharaoh preserved order. The priests maintained communication with the sacred realm. Most people accepted this structure because it seemed woven into the fabric of reality itself. But stability was never guaranteed. Periods of prosperity could suddenly give way to famine, political turmoil, corruption, or foreign threats. When hardship intensified, difficult questions naturally emerged. If the gods protected Egypt, why was suffering spreading across the land? During times of crisis, confidence in traditional institutions often weakened. Local officials abused power. Economic inequality grew. Harvests failed. Communities faced uncertainty about the future. In such moments, many Egyptians began seeking more personal forms of spiritual connection. Instead of relying entirely on grand state cults, they turned toward private prayers, household shrines, protective amulets, and local religious practices. Faith did not disappear. It became more personal, more direct, and in some cases, less dependent on the enormous religious structures that had dominated society for centuries. Evidence from personal letters, inscriptions, and everyday objects reveals a fascinating shift. Ordinary people increasingly expressed individual concerns directly to divine powers. They prayed for health, family protection, justice, and relief from hardship. These requests reflected a changing relationship with the sacred. Rather than viewing religion solely through the authority of temples and priests, many Egyptians began seeking personal access to divine assistance. The gods were becoming part of private life in new ways. This transformation did not amount to open rebellion against religion. It was something more subtle and perhaps more significant. The center of spiritual gravity was gradually expanding. Religious experience was no longer confined to monumental architecture and official ceremonies. It was entering homes, workshops, villages, and individual lives. As this happened, the monopoly of large institutions over spiritual authority became less absolute. People still respected the gods, but they increasingly engaged with them on their own terms. Political instability accelerated these developments. As different dynasties rose and fell, as foreign powers entered Egyptian territory, and as traditional structures faced repeated challenges, old certainties became harder to maintain. New ideas circulated. Different cultures interacted. Spiritual practices evolved. The religious landscape that once appeared permanent began adapting to a changing world. What had been stable for centuries now faced pressures from multiple directions. The remarkable resilience of Egyptian religion came from its ability to absorb these changes rather than simply resist them. The gods survived because they evolved alongside the people who worshipped them. Yet an unexpected consequence emerged from this process. As Egypt changed, its gods began traveling beyond Egypt itself. Their influence crossed borders, entered foreign cultures, and took on new forms that their earliest worshippers could never have imagined. The story of the Egyptian gods does not end with the decline of Egypt's political power. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because long after pharaohs disappeared and dynasties faded into history, the gods continued their journey across the ancient world, carrying pieces of Egypt with them into entirely new civilizations. The gods who survived their own civilization. Empires usually leave behind ruins. Their armies disappear. Their rulers become names in forgotten records. Their borders dissolve into history. Ancient Egypt followed this pattern in many ways. Dynasties collapsed. Foreign conquerors arrived. Political power shifted from Egyptian hands to Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman rulers. Yet something extraordinary happened during this long decline. While Egypt's empire faded, many of its gods refused to disappear with it. The process began slowly. Foreign merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and travelers entered Egypt and encountered a civilization unlike anything they had seen before. They walked through temples filled with mysterious symbols, witnessed elaborate ceremonies, and listened to stories about divine beings connected to death, resurrection, kingship, and cosmic order. These encounters sparked fascination. Instead of rejecting Egyptian beliefs outright, many outsiders began adapting them to their own traditions. When the Greeks gained control of Egypt after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, this cultural exchange accelerated dramatically. Greek rulers quickly realized that understanding Egyptian religion could strengthen their authority. Rather than destroying local traditions, they blended them with their own. New divine identities emerged. Egyptian and Greek characteristics merged into hybrid forms that appealed to multiple populations at once. The gods were no longer confined to the Nile Valley. They were becoming international. One of the most remarkable examples was the growing popularity of Isis. Originally rooted in Egyptian tradition, she evolved into one of the most widely worshipped divine figures in the ancient Mediterranean. Her temples appeared far beyond Egypt's borders. Sailors prayed to her for protection. Merchants carried her symbols across trade routes. Communities throughout the Roman world embraced aspects of her worship. A goddess born along the Nile was now influencing people thousands of miles away who had never seen Egypt itself. This expansion reveals an important truth about Egyptian religion. Its survival was not based solely on military power or political control. The ideas embedded within its myths addressed universal human concerns. Questions about death, justice, protection, identity, and the search for meaning resonated far beyond the civilization that first developed them. As different cultures encountered Egyptian beliefs, they discovered concepts that could be adapted to their own spiritual needs. Even as traditional temples began losing influence, Egyptian symbols continued to evolve. Images of sacred animals, solar discs, divine mothers, and resurrected rulers appeared in new contexts. Stories changed, meanings shifted, yet traces of their Egyptian origins remained visible. What had once been local traditions became part of a much larger cultural conversation spanning continents and centuries. The irony is striking. Many of the temples that created these religious traditions eventually fell silent. Priests disappeared. Sacred ceremonies ceased. Political systems that supported the gods collapsed. Yet the gods themselves achieved something their creators could scarcely have imagined. They outlived the civilization that gave them birth. Through adaptation and transformation, they continued influencing the ancient world long after Egypt's golden age had passed. But despite this remarkable survival, the most intimate evidence of what Egyptians truly believed was not preserved in foreign cities or public monuments. It remained hidden in places sealed away from the living. Deep inside tombs, behind stone walls, beneath layers of sand and centuries of silence, ancient Egyptians left messages they never expected strangers to read. And those hidden records reveal a far more personal relationship with the gods than the grand temples ever could. The secrets, the tombs, were never meant to reveal. The temples of Egypt were built to be seen. Their colossal gateways, towering columns, and massive statues projected power to the world. Tombs served a very different purpose. They were not designed for public audiences. They were not meant to impress future civilizations. They were private spaces prepared for eternity, sealed behind stone, hidden beneath deserts, and protected from intrusion. Yet it is within these silent chambers that some of the most revealing evidence about the Egyptian gods has survived. When archaeologists first entered many of these tombs, they expected to find treasures, inscriptions, and burial goods. What they discovered instead was something far more valuable, a direct glimpse into how individual Egyptians understood their relationship with the divine. Away from official ceremonies and state-sponsored religious messages, tomb walls revealed hopes, fears, doubts, and expectations that rarely appeared in public monuments. Here, religion became personal. The scenes covering these walls often tell stories far more intimate than most people realize. Individuals are shown standing before divine beings, speaking to them, receiving protection from them, and preparing for encounters that would occur after death. These images were not simple decorations. They were believed to possess real power. Every painted figure, every sacred word, and every carefully placed symbol formed part of a larger effort to secure survival beyond the grave. The tomb itself became a bridge between two worlds. As more burial texts were deciphered, another surprising detail emerged. The gods were not always portrayed as distant rulers issuing commands from above. In many cases, they appeared as guides, protectors, and companions helping individuals navigate an uncertain journey. The relationship was often deeply personal. The deceased sought reassurance, assistance, and recognition from divine forces that would determine their fate. This reveals a side of Egyptian religion that grand temple architecture often conceals. Faith was not only about maintaining cosmic order, it was also about individual hope. Some tomb inscriptions reveal concerns that feel strikingly human even today. People worried about being forgotten. They feared injustice. They hoped their lives would be judged fairly. They wanted to remain connected to their families. They longed for security in an unknown future. The gods occupied a central role in addressing these anxieties. Far from being abstract cosmic concepts, they became participants in deeply personal struggles involving memory, identity, and survival. Even more revealing are the differences found between various tombs. Beliefs were not always identical. Certain regions emphasized different divine figures. Some individuals highlighted particular gods over others. Religious ideas evolved across centuries, adapting to changing circumstances and personal preferences. This diversity challenges the common assumption that Egyptian religion was perfectly uniform. Beneath the appearance of stability existed a rich and evolving spiritual landscape shaped by countless individual experiences. These hidden chambers preserved something that official history often overlooks. They captured the emotional reality of belief, not the public rituals performed before crowds, but the private convictions carried into death itself. In the darkness of sealed tombs, Egyptians left behind evidence of what truly mattered to them when all worldly status, wealth, and power disappeared. And again, the gods remained at the center of that story. By now, a remarkable pattern has emerged. The gods were not merely mythological figures. They were political forces, guardians of order, objects of personal devotion, symbols of identity, and companions in the face of mortality. Yet one final question remains. If the evidence points in so many directions at once, then perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is the assumption that the gods served only a single purpose: to uncover the truth. We must bring together every piece of the puzzle and confront the possibility that the gods of ancient Egypt were something entirely different from what we have been told. The gods of ancient Egypt were not what we were told. When most people think of the gods of ancient Egypt, they imagine a collection of mythological characters frozen in time. A falcon-headed god representing the sky, a jackal-headed god guarding the dead, a sun god sailing across the heavens. These images have become so familiar that they seem to explain everything. Yet after following the story from Egypt's earliest communities to the secrets hidden within its tombs, that simple explanation begins to fall apart. The evidence points toward something far more complex. The gods were not merely supernatural beings living inside stories. They functioned as the framework through which Egyptians understood existence itself. They explained the movement of the heavens, the authority of rulers, the cycle of life and death, the success of harvests, the outcome of wars, and the survival of civilization. To separate religion from daily life would have been impossible because religion was the structure that gave meaning to every aspect of reality. At the same time, the gods were deeply connected to power. They legitimized kings, they strengthened governments, they united distant regions under shared beliefs. Entire institutions grew around their worship. Temples became economic centers. Priesthoods accumulated influence. Political leaders aligned themselves with divine authority to reinforce their rule. The gods were not standing outside history. They were active participants in it. Their stories evolved because the society around them evolved as well. Yet reducing them to political tools would be equally misleading. Inside tombs, personal letters, private shrines, and burial texts, we encounter another dimension entirely. Here, the gods appear as sources of comfort, protection, and hope. They helped people confront fears that every human being eventually faces: death, uncertainty, suffering, and the possibility of being forgotten. The emotional power of Egyptian religion cannot be explained solely through politics or social control. It endured because it answered questions that mattered deeply to ordinary people. Perhaps the greatest misconception comes from the modern tendency to separate categories that the Egyptians never separated. Today we distinguish between religion, government, science, culture, philosophy, and psychology. Ancient Egyptians saw these elements as interconnected parts of a single reality. Their gods existed at the center of that reality. They were cosmic principles, political authorities, cultural symbols, and psychological anchors at the same time. What appears contradictory to modern minds felt completely natural within the Egyptian worldview. This is why the gods changed over time without losing their importance. They adapted because they were never limited to a single function. New rulers could reinterpret them. New generations could connect with them differently. Foreign cultures could absorb aspects of them. Even when Egypt itself weakened politically, the ideas embedded within its divine figures continued traveling across the ancient world. The gods survived because they represented more than mythology. They represented a way of understanding existence. And that realization changes the entire story. The question is no longer whether Egyptians believed in their gods. The evidence makes that answer obvious. The more important question is why those gods became so central to one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Why did generation after generation invest extraordinary resources, labor, devotion, and imagination into preserving them? What did the Egyptians see that made these divine forces indispensable to their world? The answer may be uncomfortable for modern audiences. The gods of ancient Egypt were not simply fictional beings created to explain the unknown. They were living components of a civilization's reality. They shaped institutions, guided decisions, inspired loyalty, justified authority, and provided meaning in a world filled with uncertainty. We have spent centuries studying their images while often overlooking their true role. In many ways, we have been looking at the surface while missing the deeper story hidden beneath it. And that leads us to one final question. Thousands of years after the last great temples fell silent, why do these gods continue to fascinate us? Why do their symbols remain instantly recognizable? Why does their mystery endure when so many other ancient beliefs have faded into obscurity? The answer may reveal that the greatest legacy of Egypt was never its monuments, its treasures, or even its rulers. It may have been the questions its gods still force us to ask. The last question. Left by the gods. As the sun sets over the sands of Egypt, the temples remain. Their walls are weathered. Their colors have faded. Their priests are gone. The voices that once filled their sacred halls have been silent for centuries. Yet somehow, the gods endure. Not as rulers of an empire, but as mysteries that continue to challenge the modern world. Thousands of years after their worship faded, they still provoke questions that refuse to disappear. Throughout this journey, we have traveled far beyond the familiar images found in textbooks and documentaries. We have seen a world before the great pantheon existed. We have watched local beliefs merge into a vast spiritual system. We have explored how temples transformed the invisible into something people could experience as reality. We have uncovered a civilization that believed the survival of the universe depended upon cooperation between gods and humanity. We have followed the rise, evolution, and transformation of divine powers across centuries of change. What emerges from all of this is not a story about mythology alone. It is a story about how human beings construct meaning. The Egyptians were confronting the same uncertainties that confront every civilization: life and death, order and chaos, prosperity and disaster, memory and oblivion. Their gods became the language through which those questions could be understood. They were not merely characters in sacred stories. They were the foundation of a worldview that gave structure to existence itself. Perhaps that is why the gods survived the fall of the civilization that created them. Empires disappear when their armies fail. Dynasties end when rulers die. Political systems collapse when circumstances change. But ideas capable of addressing universal human concerns often outlive the societies that first imagined them. The Egyptian gods carried within them fears, hopes, and questions that remain familiar even today. That enduring relevance is part of what keeps their legacy alive. Yet the deeper we investigate ancient Egypt, the more difficult simple answers become. Were the gods symbols? Yes, but they were more than symbols. Were they political instruments? Certainly, but they were more than instruments of power. Were they spiritual forces? To the Egyptians, absolutely. The truth lies not in choosing one explanation over another, but in recognizing that these gods occupied many roles simultaneously. They existed at the intersection of religion, politics, culture, psychology, and identity. Modern society often seeks clear categories and definitive conclusions. Ancient Egypt resists both. Its gods challenge us because they belong to a worldview fundamentally different from our own. The mistake is not that we lack information. The mistake may be assuming that ancient people understood reality in the same way we do. The farther we step into their world, the more we realize how different their assumptions were, and how much complexity has been lost through modern simplifications. And so we arrive at the final mystery. Not who the gods were, not whether people believed in them, not even how their worship shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. The deepest mystery is why generation after generation dedicated immense effort to preserving their memory, why they filled temples, tombs, monuments, and texts with reminders of divine presence, why they were so determined to ensure these names would survive long after they themselves were gone. Perhaps the answer is standing before us even now. The gods succeeded. Thousands of years later, their temples are ruins, their priests are dust, and their empire belongs to history. Yet we are still asking questions about them. We are still searching for meaning in the symbols they left behind. We are still fascinated by the world they created. And maybe that was their greatest victory, not ruling ancient Egypt, but refusing to be forgotten.